Libertarianism, the opposition to the garrison state, and it will be a two-part presentation. If time permits, after the two talks, we'll take joint questions and answers to both professors. However, that depends on how much time is left after each speaks. The first talk will be by Professor Leonard Liggio on our isolationist heritage. The second talk will be by Walt the Grinder on the role of corporate liberal foundations in shaping American foreign policy. Leonard Liggio is a professor of history at the City College of New York and the former co-editor with Murray Rothbard of Left and Right magazine. Walt the Grinder is a professor of economics at Rutgers University. I turn the forum over at this time to Professor Leonard Liggio.
Thank you, Gary Greenberg. I must say it makes my task a little easier to follow immediately after Murray Rothbard, because in some ways he's introduced some of the basic concepts of the kinds of problems that I'm going to be dealing with. And that is the almost methodological problems that have divided some libertarians. That is the question of how to relate to the real world, because there has been, for a period, although this was not originally the case, a situation where many libertarians do not want to relate to a real existing world, a world that is not absolutely libertarian, where many people do not explicitly, whatever they may do implicitly or in a confused way, do not explicitly act in a libertarian fashion. And this does create a problem, and I know the problem. I know I've wrestled with it myself long ago, and not just once. It is a real problem about how to relate to the real world. And Murray Rothbard has talked a little bit about that problem in talking about the situation that existed in the American colonial period, especially in the 17th century and the founding of the original colonies and the struggles that went on at that time. And obviously there were situations in that development where there were very few ideal libertarian solutions implemented, where libertarians had to deal with other people who were not libertarians, and had to deal with political situations where there were many people who had ideas closer to the libertarians than to the statists, but weren't libertarian themselves, and therefore the libertarians had to decide whether to sit in their farmhouses and pay taxes, sit in their farmhouses and have their philosophical and intellectual beliefs questioned every week by some government authority, whether to pay the taxes or to try and struggle against that and try and change the situation. And as we've seen, most of them came from a tradition of not acquiescing in the system, not sitting back and relaxing and complaining about the fact that most of their fellow citizens were not pure libertarians, but tried to work in the context of an actual situation to achieve libertarian solutions, and in the process of doing so, to try and convert some of their fellow people in conflict to a more pure libertarian position, because obviously the people involved, while not explicitly libertarian, had a few, if not several, libertarian concepts in their own minds which impel them to participate, to unite in the kinds of struggles in the colonial period. Now, the question of foreign policy is an even more difficult one, but of the same kind. One can sit back and say that since the issues involved are issues involving government, that therefore one should not try to relate to them at all, In other words, foreign policy issues are issues that would not exist in a libertarian society. And yet we're faced with the fact that we don't live in a libertarian society. So we can either try and pretend that we do by existing in some very inward, private situation of our own, or we can face the reality and try and deal with it. Now, I could easily imagine the pleasure of sitting back and trying not to deal with the real world if the real world did not continue to impinge upon us. In other words, it's not a matter of our sitting back and ignoring foreign policy, because foreign policy persists in impinging on us. It impinges on us just because it is a state operation, and the state impinges on us constantly. It may impinge on us in terms of conscription and registration for the draft, the whole situation in regard to militarism. It impinges on us constantly in the form of taxation. It impinges on us in the form of questioning of our beliefs, in trying to suppress dissent. But probably the one that most people would find in the general world most unpleasant is the fact that foreign policy impinges on us in terms of taxation, in terms of our income. And in the 20th century, and especially in the last quarter of the quarter century, the government budget has been principally a budget concerned with foreign affairs, and therefore the taxes that we're paying are directly connected to government foreign policy, so that even the ordinary libertarian, the libertarian who may not take a deep interest in what's going on in the world, but who at least has the ordinary libertarian reaction against paying any taxes, has to relate to the fact that the government is impinging constantly upon him in the form of the government budget, in the form of taxation, especially the income tax. And it therefore behooves libertarians to take some position vis-a-vis government policy and foreign affairs, if only for the practical reason of decreasing or eliminating the impingement of taxation upon them. This, in fact, has been the reaction historically of libertarians, and as, again, Murray Rothbard's talk indicated, in part because of disinterest by libertarians, in part because libertarian history is not readily available. Libertarians do not know their own history. And what I'd like to talk to you about is some of the libertarian tradition in terms of foreign policy. And in terms of foreign policy, that libertarian tradition is known historically as isolationism. This policy, this viewpoint, this attitude goes back to the kind of heyday of American libertarianism and laissez-faire concepts, which would be the period of the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian periods, the first half of the 19th century. And it is so well known that this was the period of the kind of flowering both of libertarian concepts and of some attempts to put libertarianism into practice. And it also was a period where these libertarians reacted against the attempts to reintroduce statism in a much more virulent form at the midpoint of the 19th century. And this was done starting with the American war with regard to the annexation of Texas and the war against Mexico. And flowing from that, one would find the whole process of reimposition of a virulent form of statism in the United States, the subsidies to the railroads, again justified on military grounds after the war, the remilitarization in American society after the Mexican War. And it is in the Mexican War where libertarians begin to put forth a clear libertarian position on foreign policy, and in which it is first described as an isolationist policy, that the libertarian opposition to American foreign policy is described as isolationist. And this is directly tied in this period with the most advanced flourishing of libertarian thought, the abolitionist movement in the first half of the 19th century. As Murray Rothbard pointed out, the leader of the abolitionist movement, William Lloyd Garrison, was also a recognized anarchist thinker, and this was the case for most of the important libertarian writers and speakers of the period. They were strong opponents of the Mexican War, as well as of war in general, and of militarization of society. And it was in this so-called no-government tradition of the early 19th century, which continued through the Civil War, the strong opposition of even many of the abolitionists to the Union aggression against Southern independence in the Civil War period, and then in the late 19th century. And the most fascinating and important of these libertarians was the man who was probably the most important libertarian thinker of the last half of the 19th century, Edward Atkinson. He was a person who had been brought up in the abolitionist tradition, had been active in abolitionist societies, and was in the late 19th century the principal writer on libertarian themes in the United States. He was a leading textile manufacturer and a leading insurance company executive. He had begun his career in those activities before the Civil War, and as such had been a principal figure in, for instance, the Boston Vigilance Committee, which was a committee set up to free fugitive slaves from the government jails in Boston, something along the line of the freeing technique used in the colonial period that Murray Rothbard referred to. He was very closely involved in the fighting to break into the jails to free the fugitive slaves. He was very active in the committee that raised the money for the guns to go to the abolitionist guerrilla forces, both in Kansas and in John Brown's raid against the slave government in Virginia in the late 1850s. And he continued to be active and even more strongly outspoken in libertarian activities during the late 19th century. But his most important contribution came in the period of the American war against Spain and the continuation of that in the conquest and of the insurrection, the attempt at national liberation in the Philippine Islands after the war. Because Atkinson was the leader of the anti-imperialist league, which was set up by principally libertarians in the United States. William Graham Sumner, for instance, was one of the principal figures in that, Charles Norton of Harvard, a whole range of people who were very active in libertarian circles and who had come out of the no-government tradition of the abolitionists and then the post-Civil War period. And they engaged in as strong a struggle as had appeared up until then against American imperialism. Atkinson was threatened by the McKinley government with imprisonment on a number of occasions on the ground that he was instilling mutiny in the American forces. Atkinson wrote pamphlets aimed at the American troops, and especially American troops in the Philippine Islands who were used in the suppression of the national liberation movement in the Philippines. And for these efforts, for these pamphlets, for his fundraising activities in that regard, Atkinson was threatened several times by the McKinley administration with sedition trials and imprisonment in Fort Warren in Boston. And his pamphlets were seized by the U.S. mail. They were destroyed by the U.S. Mail Service. And this raised a number of very, very energetic campaigns with regard to government mail monopoly with regard to the use of government powers against private citizens, in regard to the rights of the troops to read whatever mail was sent to them, whatever articles were sent to them, and also created the conditions in which the McKinley administration and then later the Theodore Roosevelt administration had to face constant criticism within Congress after this campaign by the Anti-Imperialist League was engendered against their policies. So that the major brunt of what might be called modern anti-imperialism and modern isolationism had its origins in the libertarian movement of the late 19th century, and was centered in the publications of that movement, such as The Nation, which under Godkin and Garrison Jr. and Oswald Garrison Villard was the principal spokesman for all libertarian ideas. And one of the main points that Godkin and young Garrison and Oswald Garrison Villard made continually from that point on was that socialism would come to the United States as well as to other countries through imperialism and through militarization. That the growth of the government budget that was engendered by foreign policy activities would be the condition in which socialism would take place. And the prophetic nature of their understanding of the situation was unbelievable. And of course, at that time, there were many libertarians who did not think that was the case, who thought that there were other dangers, that Samuel Gompers and the AFL was a major threat to some kind of trend towards libertarianism. And of course, history has proven them to be totally mistaken. It was the United States government, it was militarization, it was imperialist foreign policy, which was the principal means by which the United States government has moved from the partial socialism of the post-Civil War period engendered by Civil War measures to the more and more complete one, which has become most complete, obviously, since whatever it is, August 13th, or whenever the President's message was presented. So that one of our principal legacies from our early libertarian heritage is the understanding of the role not only of the state, but of the state's foreign policy as a principal weapon, principal instrument for the introduction of further statism and for the completion of socialism. And this became more and more evident in the First World War period, where Villard, where especially Albert J. Nock, Randolph Bourne, and other libertarians were the principal opponents of American intervention in World War I and suffered accordingly. The major case of a non-socialist publication being seized by the U.S. government was the case against Albert J. Nock's editorial in the September 1918 Nation, where Albert J. Nock attacked Gompers as a tool of American imperialism. Gompers was being used to prevent any agitation, not only among American workers, but also European workers, against the war. And Albert J. Nock's brilliant critique of Gompers' role as a tool of the Wilson administration led to the suppression of the seizure by the government of that issue of the Nation, and threats against Nock as a possible object for sedition trial. So that when the libertarians came out of World War I, one of their principal interests was to try and focus the attention of the American public, and of course libertarians in general, on foreign policy. So that Nock, when he founded the Freeman in 1920, made the Freeman the central vehicle for revisionism, for historical revisionism, for the analysis and critique of American foreign policy. And it was one of the few magazines which was willing to publish lengthy critiques of American foreign policy, starting with Albert J. Nock's own critique of American foreign policy, and then the writings of people like Harry Elmer Barnes and others. And this tradition continued more strongly even in the 1930s, where you have the real growth and flowering of the American isolationist movement and its strong libertarian undercurrent. So many of the intellectuals, so many of the writers connected with American isolationism in the 30s were libertarians, were people who have been closely identified with the history of our own heritage. And when the war came, these people were subjected, in some cases, to sedition trials in World War II. In other cases, to what Harry Elmer Barnes has referred to as the historical blackout. The establishment closed down on any publication of material by libertarians about foreign policy. And therefore, this has created the kind of drought for libertarians in foreign policy, in the foreign policy area. The libertarians who were isolationists were subjected to a very heavy campaign of suppression. And this really was not remedied even until practically the last decade, so that there were decade-long periods when libertarians writing on foreign policy issues did not have open to them anything other than their own private pamphlets. Harry Elmer Barnes, for instance, had to privately publish all of the many very, very important pamphlets on revisionism and isolationism which he wrote. And you can imagine the limited circulation which they had enjoyed up until the present time. So that the libertarian tradition in foreign policy, our isolationist heritage, is one which it is understandable that very few libertarians are aware of, since the manipulation of it and the suppression of it by the establishment, by the media, has been one of the most important developments with regard to libertarian thought. And this is the reason why so many of the people who in the 1930s and 40s who had been interventionists, therefore had been supporters of American foreign policy, principally New Deal imperialism in the 30s and 40s, but for one reason or another had disagreements within the New Deal camp and became quote-unquote conservatives, became leading spokesmen of foreign policy associated with the so-called New Right that developed in the 1950s. The problem of the absence for so many years of a viable published critique due to suppression by the media of the libertarian, the isolationist point of view, made it an open road, an easy road for the New Right, for the ex-communists and ex-New Dealers who flooded into the right wing and tried to influence libertarians in foreign policy questions, to introduce the whole Cold War mythology, the whole question of trying to make the Soviet Union the scapegoat and then China as the scapegoat, and to concentrate attention not on our own government, which should be the principal interest of libertarians. Our government is the enemy, our state is the enemy, and instead to deflect it into other directions, into a really self-defeating and negative Cold War ideology. And I think the principal way that one is going to be able to enter into some kind of contact with the libertarian heritage is to begin reading some of the many books that do exist, although they never were widely publicized, on the development of American foreign policy as the root of American statism. And if you want just one book to begin with, I would recommend one or another of Arthur E. Kirch's books, The Decline of American Liberalism or The Civilian and the Military, because Arthur E. Kirch is one of the best libertarian historians that's been writing. He was a very, very principled opponent and suffered for it of World War II, and has written very, very wisely and from a libertarian perspective on foreign policy since that time. And I'll conclude then by recommending once again the Arthur E. Kirch volumes for anyone who really wants to know and understand something about our libertarian heritage in foreign policy, that is to say, the heritage of isolationism. Thank you.